All right, well, I will start off a couple of extra things to share with you today before we get going, so I'll take up that extra time now. Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Office of the Chief Scientist Science Seminar Series. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Andrew Paul. I'm a Senior Science Advisor with the Office of the Chief Scientist and will be the host for this fall series of seminars. On behalf of my entire team, or our entire team at the office, we welcome you to today's event. I want to thank those of you that are joining us from last year that filled out the survey at the end of last season. Thank you very much for that feedback. It's been excellent. We're always appreciative to get that feedback and incorporate those suggestions that we have. I do want to share with you that, since this series started back in 2018, we've had over 10,000 attendees join the seminars. And last year, the average number of people attending each of the individual seminars was 171 people. So thanks everyone for that continued support and turning these discussions into a great success. In the keeping of the tradition of gathering, these science seminars provide us an opportunity to learn more about the lands that we all live on, enjoy, and depend. I'd ask everyone throughout today's seminar to recognize that we are on traditional lands of the First Nations and Inuit peoples. We're also on the homeland of the Métis. Their histories, cultures, and knowledge provides a deep and influential understanding to the land and how we interact with it. Let us always keep in mind that the shared relationships that we all have through the land, and it's these shared relationships that can help us move reconciliation forward. In that spirit of sharing, any questions you have today or comments, please enter them at any time into the chat window that is in Teams. Hopefully, yes, there's a little chat box should be at the top of your Teams window. You can open that chat box and enter those questions or comments. We will save all those questions and comments until the very end, and I'll read them out in the order that we received them so that our presenters today can respond. Your video and audio are disabled. I guess with 171 people on average attending, we need to do that to maintain the quality of the connections that we have today. So with that, I'm really looking forward to introducing our speakers today. We've got Dr. Colleen St Clair, John Paczkowski, and Peter Thompson. They're going to kick off our fall science seminar series with their presentation titled Calculating the Zone of Influence of Human Activity on Wary Wildlife. Colleen is a professor of biological sciences at the University of Alberta, where she's been since 1998. She and her students study the way wildlife use and move through human-dominated landscapes, which frequently involves human-wildlife conflict. John is a biologist with over 30 years of experience working with large carnivores. Currently, he's the human-wildlife coexistence team lead for the Kananaskis region with Alberta Forestry and Parks. He's in Canmore, where he works with a large team of volunteers and students on numerous research and monitoring projects in that region. And then Peter is an ecologist who studies human-wildlife coexistence in both terrestrial and marine systems. Peter has worked with grizzly bears, polar bears, wolves, and killer whales, and is interested in developing statistical and computational tools that can help optimize and inform land management and biodiversity conservation, particularly in areas where humans and wildlife interact. So with that, I will be quiet. I'll turn off my camera and turn it over to our presenters today. Thank you very much.
Well, hello everyone, welcome. Thanks for taking some time out to let us share this work with you. Here in Alberta Parks and Kananaskis country, we're constantly facing the challenge of trying to balance the needs of wildlife and increasing recreational demands, and it's not always a good balance. So we're always looking for good, robust data to sort of back up some of the conservation initiatives. Throughout our region here, we use an array of tools and cameras and counters and GPS collars to sort of help inform some of the decisions that are made. And again, I'll acknowledge that a lot of this work is done by volunteers. When the opportunity came up to collaborate with the Office of the Chief Scientist and with Colleen, it was really exciting to sort of, ask some questions about the corridor use and how wildlife are responding to people. So yeah, I look forward to following this through, and this has spawned a whole bunch of other collaborations. And we have amazing long-term data sets for those of you who are interested or want to collaborate. Please do reach out after the seminar. Colleen?
Yeah, I'll spend just a couple of minutes acknowledging how much I appreciate the vision that Jonathan Thompson brought as in his role as chief scientist to encourage more collaboration between what was then Alberta Environment and Parks, but now Alberta Environment and Protected Areas, and together with Alberta Forestry and Parks, to work together, increasing the emphasis by academics on priority topics for those government departments. This has been just a great opportunity, and the work that Peter rather is going to share in a moment is possible because of that vision. And I have thoroughly enjoyed working with Peter and John and another of our co-authors, Jesse Whittington from Parks Canada. And I hope you enjoy hearing about this work as well.
Okay, well, I think I will take it away then, if that's all right. Thanks, John and Colleen, and as well Andy, for the introduction. As you may have heard already, my name is Peter. I'm a postdoc. Currently, I'm located at Simon Fraser University, but before that, I was working at U of Alberta with Colleen and John, and also Jesse Whittington, who is part of Parks Canada. And today I'm going to be presenting about the work that we all did together, trying to learn a little bit more about how human use, particularly recreational use of the landscape, affects wildlife, particularly large, wary carnivore species. So I'll introduce a little bit of the problem, which John and Colleen sort of already touched for me. But the short version is that there are more and more people in the world than there ever have been. And we are expanding, and we are developing the world, and we are molding the world to meet our needs. And this is having all sorts of impacts on wildlife, namely the shared space and the shared regions of the world where humans and wildlife are meant to coexist. And because of all of this, because of all these interactions and because of all of this shared space between humans and wildlife, people have become very interested in studying these interactions, both from a lens of conflict, but more recently from a lens of coexistence, giving this more positive connotation to these interactions. Now, this is a really difficult problem for many reasons. In some cases, wildlife can be dangerous or pose various risks to humans. Of course, bears are a typical example. But more often than that is humans are going to typically negatively impact wildlife. And often humans will displace wildlife. So wildlife will not occupy areas that are heavily trafficked by people or have been occupied by humans. And this is problematic because by occupying these areas, people are effectively reducing the amount of available habitat for these wary species. And from the perspective of conserving and managing these lands, we want to have a good idea of how much habitat, how much land out there is actually available and secure and usable for some of these more wary wildlife species that have potentially more specialized habitat requirements. A big problem with this is sometimes human use at a certain area will propagate in terms of its impact across space. This can be because people make lots of noise or produce bright light, or for certain species, produce very potent smells. And so not only is the area that we occupy going to potentially be unusable for some wildlife species, but potentially even an area buffered around that And this is a term that a lot of people interested in human-wildlife coexistence have deemed the zone of influence. And it's really important. I'm going to try to convince you why this is really important for management. We can illustrate that with kind of a toy example here. And let's imagine that in some natural area, we want to establish a wildlife corridor or some sort of protected area that is theoretically not supposed to have any trails, because we want some of these wary species like grizzly bears and wolves to roam freely through this area. And let's say for whatever reason, we decide to make the corridor 2,000 meters wide, as is indicated here. This might be in order to meet some minimum area threshold for the total amount of suitable habitat in an area. And then outside of the corridor, we don't really have much control over what's going on. There might be lots of trails, lots of human use, lots of people making noise, affecting the environment, and displacing and disturbing these wildlife species. The problem with this example is that the zone of influence has been neglected. So effectively, the areas buffered around these trails or the edges of the corridor are potentially going to be unusable or unattractive for wildlife that are wary of people. So, they're going to hear people biking, or they're going to smell it, or they're going to remember a previous encounter with humans that they had in that area. And actually, the kind of effective width of this wildlife corridor is going to be quite a bit smaller than we had initially intended. So in short, being aware of these zones of influence and having a rough idea of what they are is really crucial for ensuring that we actually know how much secure habitat there is on the landscape. And in essence, that's why a lot of people have been interested in this idea. As technology has increased and we are able to acquire more and more high quality data and fit more fancy numerical models, there's also been the ability to represent this zone of influence as a continuous function of space rather than just identifying a discrete buffer. And while there are benefits and drawbacks to both of these approaches, this allows us to more effectively characterize the entire landscape of influence, including potentially smaller but still significant influences at farther away distances. And indeed, people have attempted to estimate or calculate these zones of influence for quite a variety of different species across the world. And I'm showing just a few studies from the two species I'll be focusing on today, grizzly bears and gray wolves, here in this graph. And you can see that some of them are taking this more discrete form with sharp drop-offs representing the edge of the buffer, and others have this more smooth graduated decline over distance, reflecting the more continuous influence function. The main takeaway from this graph, in my opinion, is that existing studies are not always in agreement about what the true zones of influence are for these species. And while these quantities might in truth vary as a result of, different environmental conditions or different times, it's quite likely as well that a lot of this difference has occurred as a result of methodological decisions. For example, when calculating the impact of a nearby anthropogenic feature like a trail on wildlife, people might neglect the impact of other trails, for example, ones that are slightly further away. And this might be especially relevant in areas where there are dense networks of many trails that might all have an impact on wildlife use. And so one of the things that Colleen and John and Jesse and I wanted to do with the data that John described is we wanted to more cumulatively quantify human use across the landscape and then test the cumulative effects of all of this human use, both at the focal location as well as nearby areas on our wildlife. And in order to do this, we needed some sort of data collection technique that allowed us to observe both humans and wildlife in the same area, ideally at the same time. And we get exactly that with camera traps. John and Jesse as well have been instrumental in orchestrating the deployment and continued maintenance of over 1,000 camera traps throughout the Canadian Rockies, most of them in Alberta. And these have produced invaluable invaluable amounts of data on both grizzly bears and wolves, as well as humans, and in fact, many other wildlife species that we chose not to study here. Camera traps are great because they're relatively cheap. They're non-invasive, so you just put a camera up and you leave, and as long as you change the batteries every few months, they are always on and working. So they just give us such a great wealth of data and really allow us to assess these community metrics and interactions between different populations. So as I mentioned, we were interested in identifying this zone of influence for our two focal species here, grizzly bears and wolves, with a particular focus on the non-motorized human recreation, which is basically just the type of human detections we were getting on the cameras, because most of them were placed in either trails or backcountry areas. The red parallelogram there roughly displays the spatial extent of our study area. And in total, our cameras were on for a cumulative amount of, I think, over 3,000 years, spaced across from 2007 to 2022. So we had a ton of data. And that resulted in over 10,000 images of both our focal species, as well as over 1 million images of people, reflecting the great deal of human use in this area, which includes the towns of Canmore and Banff, and Lake Louise, and the entire, or in a large part of the Bow River Valley, which is a huge corridor for human transportation. And human use is continuing to increase in these areas, as indicated by the graph here on the bottom right. So we wanted to design some models that could basically link these quantities together. How does human use affect wildlife use, and how does that effect propagate across distances? And a natural way to do this is by using Poisson process models. So these are a really general and flexible family of statistical models that can basically be used for any data representing events. And so in the case of our camera traps, we have this camera that is constantly sampling. So we have kind of this continuous sampling period in which the camera was on. And an event can occur theoretically at any time in that camera. Here, when I say an event, I'm thinking about the detection of a bear or a wolf or a person. And the quantity that we're interested in is basically the intensity of these events, or the rate at which these events are likely to occur at any location and or time. So this is some mysterious function that we want to try to fit to data. We want to try to estimate what that function looks like. And in our case, we're going to assume that that function depends on a bunch of covariates or a bunch of predictors. And the important one that we're going to try and flesh out is the presence of humans as a covariate in the intensity or detection function of wildlife. So more on some of the covariates we included. So we fit models to both humans and wildlife, and the approach was relatively similar. We used this Poisson process framework. And we wanted to make sure that in our models for wildlife, we could effectively predict where humans were everywhere on the landscape. And so this is why we first fit a model to identify the potential predictors of human use, or at least non-motorized human recreation throughout the landscape. And so we included things that might potentially influence the aesthetic experience that recreationalists might have, including the topography of the landscape, as well as proximity to bodies of water. And we also wanted to include covariates measuring how easy a certain location would be for a person to access. And so things like distance from roads or trails, as well as major towns, we believed it would be quite likely that those things would influence where people are going to go. You know, it's less likely that someone's going to hike deep into the backcountry versus taking a short hike right outside of town. And then we also assumed that human use would be autocorrelated spatially across the landscape. And there would be many factors that we wouldn't necessarily be able to explain with these simple variables, like the presence of hotspots for human use, places like Lake Louise where people just love to go. And so we also included the human density at nearby sites as an additional covariate. And this sort of interpolation technique allowed us to improve our predictions at places where we potentially didn't have as much information from the cameras. And then the output from that human traffic model or human use model was directly incorporated into the models for wildlife, which also included various environmental predictors that the literature suggests would help better explain and predict the patterns of these species occurrence. And once again, crucially, in our models, we not only included the amount of people recorded at the camera, the focal camera where the wildlife were recorded, but we also included human use at nearby sites as predicted by our human use model. And so to illustrate why the first step was necessary here, I'm going to kind of zoom into a spatial subset of our study area. This is actually just south and east of Canmore, Alberta, in the Bow River Valley, and just south of the Trans-Canada Highway. So this is a place where lots of people go to recreate. And every single one of these little orange lines is a trail that people might be using. In truth, a lot of these trails are undesignated, so they were not officially, they're not supposed to be there effectively. People aren't supposed to be using them. They may have been constructed illegally, but nevertheless, they receive quite a bit of use. And so with great thanks to John, we were able to place cameras all over the landscape, but John is only one human being, and as a result, he's not going to be able to place a camera on every single trail or every single pixel of the landscape here. And so we do have lots of areas of this very densely trafficked study area where we don't have cameras. And our predictive model for human use allowed us to effectively interpolate those areas where we don't have data and more absolutely estimate the total distribution of where everybody is. And you can see that the darkness of the scale here, which indicates higher density, kind of directly correlates with the presence of trails. I'll kind of flip back and then back here again. And you can also see some other things that the model picked up, for example, in areas in the northwest, which is a bit closer to the town of Canmore. The model predicts a little bit more use because people were more frequently detected near towns and major roads. Our model also identified that undesignated trail use was 65% as high as designated trail use on average, which is not surprising to people who are familiar with the area, but still quite a shocking and alarming finding from the data here that there's this much use on undesignated trails. Anyway, the output of this model was something that we could kind of plug right into our models for wildlife, which was our real final objective, to link this map here across multiple spatial scales to the detection patterns of wildlife on the cameras. And to reiterate, our intensity function was basically a combination of the environmental covariates we included with the human density, both at the focal camera, so at the exact place where the wildlife are being detected, as well as all nearby locations. And that's everywhere, all these little raster squares on the map on the bottom left. We assume that all of those are going to have some contribution. And getting a little mathematical with this, I won't include too many equations here, but we can basically chalk this effect of nearby sites. We can divide this into three components. The first component is here on the right, the blue H of S. That is just the amount of human density or amount of human use predicted at any one of these raster squares here. So the cells, the S's are basically one of the pixels on the map or a location in space. And the H of S is just the absolute amount of human use. And then the green here is effectively our zone of influence function. So this is decrementing the effect of human use at locations that are further away. So this function is going to decrease as distance increases. So even if you have a very large value of this H of S, if that blue quantity is very large, but it's a very far away location, it's probably not going to contribute very much. And this green quantity will be very small, very close to zero. So the whole thing will just kind of cancel out. In this equation, we also have a parameter that we are going to fit to the data and try and estimate, and that's this A here. And that A is effectively the decay rate of this function. So depending on the value of that A there, the effect is going to decay more or less quickly. And that's going to tell us something about how much more of an effect human use will have if it's nearby versus if it's far away. And from that, we'll be able to basically plot our influence function in the same way that I had shown with the existing studies previously. And then the last bit is this red component, which is the selection coefficient. So this is just telling us what the impact is of basically one additional human on wildlife presence. So if this value, this beta here, is negative, that would kind of imply that wildlife are negatively affected by the presence of humans on the landscape. So with that, we fit this model to all of the data for both grizzly bears and wolves, and we're able to estimate a bunch of these parameters, including both for some of the human quantities as well as quantities related to the environment. I'll run through some of the things for the environmental covariates first. Most of the stuff we found was fairly concordant with the existing literature on these very well-studied species. Gray wolves had relatively low levels of habitat preference for really anything, which kind of corroborates a lot of existing research suggesting that they're fairly generalistic species. And then grizzly bears had a little bit more habitat preference, particularly for what our land cover models classified as either barren or recently burned habitat, which, because our study period lasted over 10 years, could represent selection for yummy second growth foods that are growing up in recently burned areas and attracting hungry bears. We also found significant impacts of landscape topography on habitat use. Once again, unsurprising that both of these species heavily avoid highly sloped areas and also avoided areas that on average get lots of snow cover, which is kind of an ecological indicator of all sorts of other things, including kind of productivity and permeability for movement. But most importantly, we were able to estimate zone of influence functions and effectively add to the plot that I'd showed previously. And the zone of influence functions that we estimated from our data are shown here with the thicker blue and red lines for grizzly bears and wolves, respectively. The key finding here, although both of our curves do kind of fall within the range of existing work, but generally they seem to overestimate or estimate more of a zone of influence than previous work might have done. And a potential reason for this is the way that we included the effect of not just the nearest feature or the nearest trail, but included all nearby components of human use. And that potentially allowed the model to identify contributions, even lower intensity contributions, but still contributions of potentially high use features that are quite a ways away. So to sort of wrap up, and I think I might finish a little bit early, but maybe that's a good thing because it allows more time for questions. But I wanted to go through a few different ways that managers can use these tools and apply some of these results to problems that they're facing. And to do that, I'm just going to isolate the functions that we have here. So remove the existing literature and just use our functions. And I want to go back to the comparison between a discrete scale and a continuous scale. These are continuous functions, but sometimes it can be really useful for land managers to identify some sort of threshold or buffer distance that is informed by science and can be kind of put into practice more effectively. You know, these continuous functions are sometimes a bit more difficult to do that with. And the nice thing about this, though, is that we can basically translate these into some sort of discrete buffer or threshold simply by kind of plotting a desired value on the graph here. And an example of that would be, let's say, for example, we want to identify the distance at which the relative influence of human use is 50% as strong as it would be directly on the trail. And we can use these functions to determine that value for both grizzly bears and wolves. So for example, with grizzly bears, our model suggests that human use that is approximately 267 meters away will have about half of the displacing effect as human use directly where the bear is located. And so potentially we can buffer trails by 267 meters. And we can be sure that anything outside of that buffer is at most 50% affected by human use on the trail. We could also, pick a more conservative value and come up with a greater buffer, or, it's flexible for the needs of any given management situation. You can also do this kind of transformation the other way by identifying a distance, for example, 1 kilometer, and then calculating using the zone of influence functions, the percentage of influence of wildlife use. So for example, if we're focusing on wolves, a point that's about 1 kilometer away from a trail will have about 35% of the effects of human use as human use directly at that location. So we can, you can do this for any distance that you desire, or any kind of strength of influence that you desire. And actually, as part of a process of trying to make this a bit more applicable and usable for land managers everywhere, I designed a little web app, just a little website that you can access with the link just below the title there. And feel free to reach out to me after if you'd like to see the link as well. But this basically allows you to type any distance or any desired strength of influence, as I just did, except it can be more flexible for whatever needs you might have or whatever interests you might have. And it also comes with estimates of uncertainty with 95% credible intervals, basically confidence intervals. And it works for both grizzly bears and wolves. So obviously these results are designed and derived from a study on just these 2 species in just the central Canadian Rockies, but potentially it's something that could help inform management outside of those areas, or even just be kind of a template for people working on similar problems in other ecological systems. Let's see. Okay, that clicked through. So that's one way that we can use these results. And another way is we can use the influence functions to develop species-specific estimates of total human disturbance, or at least in this case, recreation disturbance at any location in space. So I'll come back, and here this map is our predicted amount of human use at each location in a more zoomed out part of the Bow River Valley, kind of between the towns of Banff and Canmore. And you can basically see that there are little veins of darkness in the map there, which represent trails, which is where most human recreation takes place. And so this is already informative because it tells us where people are, but it doesn't account for the influence functions for both of our species. And when we take those influence functions and put them into place here, we get these disturbance indices that are basically smoothed out versions of the human use predictions for both grizzly bears and wolves. So these are species-specific metrics that depend on the parameters that we estimated from each data set. And what this is showing you is basically at each point, it's calculating the total influence from all nearby raster cells. So it's calculating from all of the nearby trails that are relevant and within that zone of influence. And that's why it's kind of smoothed out, because as you get further away from these very prominent features, you kind of it slowly decays and kind of goes back to a more fundamental basic value. The reason that these disturbance indices are useful is because this is effectively what was incorporated into our original models as a predictor. And in fact, a quick visual analysis of the data suggests that they do quite a good job predicting carnivore use, even without including any of the other covariates. So this is just simply model predicted detection rates for grizzly bears and wolves as a function of the disturbance indices we calculated. And you can see when kind of comparing these curves and shaded regions representing uncertainty to the actual data, which is represented by dots and lines, it does a fairly good job representing the rate and intensity of decay, as wildlife are much more likely to occur in places with lower disturbance indices. I'll also add that the histograms in the background here represent the total number of cameras in each of these kind of bins of human disturbance. And you can really see that quite a few cameras that we had deployed are located in areas that receive a lot of disturbance. Now, obviously, there's a bias here because the cameras were not placed completely randomly in our study, but it does really show you how much of the landscape has been affected by humans and is effectively worse habitat for wildlife just because of the sheer density of human recreation and the extensiveness of some of the trail networks here. So just to recap, in addition to contributing to a vast literature on zones of influence and human-wildlife coexistence, I really hope that this work can continue, or I really hope that this work can inform management and help people like John and Jesse that are making these decisions about how to manage these wildlife in the real world. And I think the results set up to do that with two ways. And the first is the zone of influence function I discussed, which can potentially inform a more optimized development of corridors and other buffers. And then also with our disturbance indices, these can potentially be used in a more predictive manner to more effectively characterize habitat quality and potentially identify areas that might be used more if it weren't for high density of human recreation. I'm continuing to work on this as much as I can, and I think there are places to improve as the system is very complex, and there are definitely more dials and buttons that we can include into this modeling work. One thing I'm really interested in is trying to use the cameras to parse out different recreation user groups, which most human detections have been identified as either bikers or hikers or runners or people with dogs, people with horses. And so I think it would be really interesting if it's possible to try and parse out these effects of these different groups. I also didn't talk much about temporal dynamics today, but it is really important for wildlife, particularly because of a lot of these wary species will do something called temporal partitioning in human-dominated areas, where they will use the same spatial regions as people, but they will use them at different times of day. So once everyone goes to sleep and it's time for bed, you will see animals coming in and using some of these areas more. And there are loads of existing studies that have documented increases in nocturnality of particularly mammal species in areas where there are lots of people around. So that's something we didn't even begin to discuss, and it's also a management topic in that we can regulate when people are allowed to use certain areas. So we can implement things like temporal closures at certain times of day or times of year. And then another thing that I didn't really talk about, but is also very important, is landscape connectivity. The Bow River Valley is a place I mentioned a few times, and it's a really important feature on the landscape because it's one of the few large flat areas where animals can efficiently travel from east to west. And that opens the door for movement for animals if there is not a great deal of human disturbance. And I believe that we can expand on the work that I've been doing here in addition to some of the GPS data that John and Jesse have collected on grizzly bears and wolves in order to identify some of these kind of hotspots for connectivity, which might be different from hotspots for habitat quality as defined by some of the covariates we used. So this is such a rich area, and I hope to keep contributing and learning more about it. And I hope that this kind of research can keep rolling on as it has been in the last year. Yeah, it does appear I'm a few minutes early. I hope that's okay, but I'll say an extra long thank you to everyone who made this work possible. Of course, Colleen, John, and Jesse were invaluable in what I learned from them and the contributions that they made every step of the way. I also, of course, want to thank all of the funding organizations that made this financially possible. And of course, thank the Office of the Chief Scientist for being open to these sorts of collaborations and making these really kind of cross-institutional, cross-departmental collaborations possible. It was a really awesome experience for me. I learned a lot, and it was a great experience working with Colleen, John, and Jesse this whole way. So I think I will wrap up there.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining the seminar today. That was a great presentation, Peter, and thank you, John and Colleen, for being there. Our next science seminar is going to be on Tuesday, October 8th, where we have Dr. John Pomeroy from the University of Saskatchewan joining us, and he'll be presenting on global water future outcomes for Alberta. Just very quickly, if you're not on the mailing list for these science seminars, please ask to be added. You can send an email to the Office of the Chief Scientist's email address, which is ap.ocs@gov.ab.ca. And finally, I see people are giving lots of acknowledgements there in the reactions. But thank you again, everyone, our presenters, for a great presentation, really informative. And thanks, folks, for joining in to this great presentation. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.